Hi, so I've been working on writing this novel and it's called The Netherworld, and it's a young adult fantasy novel, and I thought I'd kind of step out of my comfort zone and share a little bit of it. This is chapter 1, and I don't think I'm going to read out the full story just because I would like to get it properly published one day, and so this is just kind of a wee taster. I might upload a bit more of it or talk a bit more about it if people are interested in that, so yeah, I just thought I'd give a wee reading. So it's the story of a young girl called Violet, and she is half vampire, half witch, and her parents are kind of not very good people. They kind of have a cult, and Violet is kind of the opposite to them. She's very shy, and she starts out in the story very kind of unsure of herself, and she doesn't have any powers, and the story is kind of all about her dealing with her trauma and starting her own life, becoming independent, kind of a coming of age type story, and it's pretty dark, but it's kind of got my own brand of dark humour in it, I think. And it does deal with a lot of kind of heavy subjects. It deals with abuse and the idea of people abusing their power. Kind of loosely inspired by the Me Too movement and kind of Harvey Weinstein type things. And I kind of wanted to use vampires as a sort of metaphor for people who would abuse their powers, and the idea that the vampires can control people and not get punished for their behaviour because they can just use their mind control powers on people. It was also kind of loosely inspired by my own kind of experiences and going through traumatic experiences and that feeling of just being like really lost and trying to find yourself and trying to reconnect with who you used to be as a person. So yeah, I'm just going to get right into it, and this is chapter 1 of The Netherworld. Violet stared in horror at the raw heart sitting on her dinner plate. It was a repulsive, slimy red slab of flesh sitting in a pool of blood. It exuded a sickly, metallic smell of death. She shuddered at the thought of touching it, let alone putting it in her mouth. Her brother Nero sat by her side at the dining table, noisily devouring his own plateful of flesh. He slurped and chewed off pieces of meat with his fangs, barely bothering to use his knife and fork. Their father sat at the head of the table, delicately slicing into a heart with his ornate silver cutlery. Violet shuffled uncomfortably in her seat. She cleared her throat and nervously spoke up. "Do I really have to eat this?" Her father shot her a cold stare from across the table, his red eyes piercing through her. "Yes," he said firmly. "You are a vampire, and you shall consume the required sustenance." He paused and raised his glass to his pale lips, taking a satisfied sip of dark red liquid. Violet gazed solemnly at the unappetizing meal. She glanced across the table at her mother. Belladonna was absorbed in the process of carefully arranging her own food on her plate. Instead of raw meat, she had a dainty salad of avocado, lettuce and radishes. She prodded it into place using her fork and held up her magic mirror at different angles, trying to capture the salad in the best light. She treated her meals as though they were works of art and sought constant approval from her followers on social media. Some evenings, the rest of the family would finish their meals while she was still in the process of choosing the right filter and typing up a caption. Her father, Lazarus, placed his glass carefully on the table. "You've been coddled for long enough," he continued, giving her a disapproving glance. "Your mother and I have decided that this summer you shall start drinking blood like a real vampire. We can't have you giving us a showing up when you start boarding school in September." He turned to his wife. "Isn't that right?" "Yes, darling," said Belladonna absent-mindedly, still focused on trying to take the perfect picture. Violet's eyes widened in dismay. She opened her mouth to speak. Lazarus angrily slammed his cutlery onto his plate. "Without consuming blood, you will be weak. It's no wonder you haven't developed your powers, you pitiful brat. I grow tired of your childish charade and your refusal to do what is natural." "It isn't natural to me," Violet thought to herself, but didn't dare say aloud. She gingerly picked up her fork and began prodding the nauseating lump of flesh. She glanced down at Wisp, her ghostly white cat familiar, who gazed up at her from underneath the table. Her wide black eyes twinkled with a look of sympathy. She rubbed her head off Violet's leg, which she couldn't feel, considering she was a ghost, but Violet felt a comforting chill nonetheless. She sliced off a tiny morsel of raw red flesh and winced at the unpleasant squelching sound the knife made as it sawed through the heart. A single drop of blood dripped off the end of her fork and created a watery red puddle on her plate. She opened her mouth a tiny fraction, then abruptly closed it again, her fork frozen in midair as if her hand were stuck in place. Her father watched her antics, not amused in the slightest, and growing increasingly impatient. "Oh, for goodness sake, leave it," he snapped. "If you refuse to eat what's given to you, then you shall just have to go hungry." Violet put down her knife and fork and shrunk into her seat. Nero stabbed his dinner violently with his fork, spraying blood onto Violet's cheek. She groaned in disgust and wiped it away with the back of her hand. "You're such a snowflake," he sneered. The corner of Lazarus's mouth turned up into a smirk. "Snowflake indeed," he chuckled as he pondered this modern expression. Her mother finally set down her magic mirror and took a nibble of salad. The screen lit up as dozens of likes and hearts came flooding in. She inhaled deeply, absorbing the energy from this burst of attention. "Will we be feeding her exclusively blood and meat?" she asked. "I do worry about the high calorie intake. She is only half vampire after all. I don't want her getting chubby." Violet self-consciously tugged at her oversized sweater. "That child needs feeding up," said Lazarus. "I intend to inform the school of her strict dietary requirements. At least 1 cup of blood a day should be adequate, and I expect her to drink it all without any fuss. I won't have her making a fool of my family name." This wasn't the first time her father had tried to coerce her into drinking blood, but it seemed like this time he was serious about implementing the rule. Her mother beamed her a dazzling white smile. "Why not indulge in some energy feeding, She tapped her magic mirror with her long manicured fingernails. "I found the most delightful source of energy recently. I discovered an online forum dedicated entirely to gossip." She clasped her hands together excitedly. "What happens is, the anonymous users choose a target, usually some minor celebrity, or anyone they find particularly annoying. Then they post every single detail of that person's life, picking apart whatever dirt they can find." She gave a wicked laugh. "It's a wonderful source for feeding. Sometimes the targets even come along to try and defend themselves. Then it's a real feast." "No thanks," said Violet, wrapping her arms around herself. "Suit yourself," Belladonna shrugged. "But you know what they say, a feeding a day keeps the wrinkles away." Although Belladonna was in her mid-40s and mother to 2 children, she could easily be mistaken for someone in her 20s. She had a minuscule waist and long, slender limbs. There were no signs of wrinkles on her sharp cheekbones, and not a single grey hair in her long blonde curls, and she intended to do whatever it took to stay that way. Her husband was much the same, over 100 years old, but resembling a movie star with an air of old-fashioned sophistication. He kept his jet-black hair neatly combed back and his formal clothing pristine. "Back in my day," he said, often beginning sentences in this way when he was about to launch into one of his long-winded complaints, "vampires didn't have to substitute their diets with meat or psychic energy. And none of these paltry bottles of animal blood that they sell to us in supermarkets. His eyes stared off into the distance. Back then, we would go out hunting all night long and experience the pleasure of fresh human blood. Yes, humans once feared us. We were intimidating forces of nature to be revered and respected. There was none of this ridiculous cancel culture that we have these days. He had recently learned this expression and now enjoyed throwing it around whenever he wanted to criticise modern society. Vampires can still bite people with their permission, Violet pointed out. Permission, Lazarus sneered. I didn't get to where I am today by asking for permission. Really, Violet, how do you expect to get anywhere in life if you can't so much as manage a heart from a pig? By your age, I was out hunting humans and animals alike. None of this shop-bought nonsense. I buy your food from the best quality butchers in town, Belladonna huffed moodily. And it's delicious, darling, but not quite the same as human blood, he said, sighing deeply. Like comparing a generic wine with a fine vintage champagne. I just grab 'em and bite them, said Nero through a mouthful of meat. Gross, said Violet. What? Nero smirked. They let you do it when you're rich and good-looking. Boys will be boys, said Lazarus cheerfully. Violet sighed. And what if the human doesn't want to be bitten? She asked quietly. Then you shall use your powers of mind control to bend them to your will, said Lazarus matter-of-factly. If you have power, it's your right to use it however you please. You can go to jail for that, she said. Oh, Violet, said Lazarus in an exasperated tone. You really are quite naive. Humans are quite easy to control. They don't remember a thing once they're under the influence of hypnosis. In any case, I only take what I need. A small amount of blood is hardly missed. Most women throw themselves at vampires such as myself. Now really, is that so wrong? What woman? Said Belladonna, eyeing him up and down suspiciously. Apollo, her crow familiar, hopped up onto the head of her chair, pointing his sharp beak in his direction. None that can hold a candle to you, my dear, he grinned. She smiled contentedly. Violet felt even more nauseous, and not just from watching her father and brother devouring the blood-soaked pig hearts. May I be excused? She asked. Yes, since I'm sick of looking at your miserable face, her father barked. Nero spluttered with laughter. Violet trailed out of the dining room with her little cat ghost following along behind. I just don't know what we're going to do with that girl, said Lazarus, letting out a sigh. You've tried your best, darling, said Belladonna. I'm sure sending her to Ursa Major will toughen her up. They are the best magic school in the country, after all. Violet hadn't yet been accepted into Ursa Major's School of Witchcraft, which her parents had decided that she was going to attend. She was dreading her entrance interview the following day, but tried not to think about it. Instead, she retreated into the safe cocoon of her bedroom, snuggled up inside a pillow fort with a book about fairies. She sometimes fantasised about being born a fairy instead of a half vampire, half witch. Then she could fly free as she wished, fluttering around small and unnoticed amongst the flowers. She could make a home inside a hollow tree and eat strawberries and honey. Or even being born a regular human would be fine by her. Then there would be no pressure to develop her powers, and no need to drink blood. She was hungry from having skipped dinner, but luckily she had a secret stash of snacks in her bedside drawer for such occasions. Most evenings she would eat whatever her mother had prepared, which usually looked better than it tasted. Salads were normally the meal of choice, being low in calories but not particularly filling. Violet supposed that her mother filled herself up on all the emotional energy that she drained from others, and food was more of an afterthought. At least salads were preferable to whatever monstrosity her dad and brother were gorging themselves on. She dreaded the thought of the upcoming summer months and having to endure more evenings of lectures and a rumbling stomach. Wisp lay curled up in a ball in her bed, her transparent body barely visible in the pale evening light. At least she never had to worry about food, being a ghost. Violet read her book for a while longer, then joined Wisp in bed for an early night, feeling mentally exhausted from the day's events. The little cat ghost snuggled up to her, purring gently as she drifted off to sleep. Unfortunately, the night was not a peaceful one. For weeks now, Violet had been suffering from unpleasant dreams. At least, she thought they were just dreams. Strangely vivid dreams that took place in this unsettling liminal space where time seemed to stand still. Long corridors, empty rooms, the smell of damp, shadowy figures in corners, vacant lamplit streets, overgrown forests with unseen scuttling creatures. An endless maze of barren spaces where there was no sense of past or future, but an endless present that seemingly stretched on forever with no way out. On this night, Violet found herself in some sort of abandoned, decaying ruin. It seemed like an old castle or mansion. Faded antique wallpaper, bruised with mould, peeled back to reveal concrete walls with mossy green roots that spread out like tiny veins. Ivy crept across the walls like an enormous green snake that had wrapped itself around the building, slowly choking it to death. A barefoot Violet carefully stepped over the debris which littered the floor, careful not to cut herself in sharp-edged stones, splinters, or broken glass. The air was musty like an old damp attic, and dust particles tickled the back of her throat. She shivered and gazed up at the trees which sprouted out from the skeleton of the building. Their branches stretched upwards to the collapsed ceiling, where they seemed to disappear into the dim, murky nothingness. She froze as she heard something moving nearby. There was a distinct pitter-patter of tiny feet and of sliding gravel and stones. She slowly turned her head to look around the barren room. A small white blob clumsily hauled itself up over a heap of stones, then let out a meow, gazing up at her with wide, twinkling black eyes. "Wisp, you scared me," Violet whispered. She felt comforted by the sight of her familiar. Wisp slid down a heap of gravel and scampered towards her. "What is this weird place?" asked Violet in a hushed voice, nervous in case they weren't alone. Wisp only tilted her head and stared up at her blankly. "We'd better find our way out, it doesn't look very safe." The ceiling groaned as if in agreement. The festering wooden beams holding up the last remaining structures didn't seem particularly sturdy. They headed through an archway into another room. It was nearly identical to the other room, apart from a large staircase coated in a thick layer of dust and gravel. To her relief, on the opposite wall there was a door. She hurried to open it, but found it locked and boarded shut with wooden planks. The building groaned and creaked again like an old, tired creature. Wisp wandered over to the staircase. "We can't go up, we need to find another door or something," said Violet. Wisp ignored her, hopping up the steps and then stopping to turn and meow, encouraging her to follow. "Come down, we can't go that way," said Violet fearfully. She carried on up the stairs, disappearing round the corner out of sight. With no other option, Violet hurried after her. She began the difficult climb up the staircase, which resembled more of a slippery slope. The gravelly surface felt rough and uncomfortable underfoot. She gripped hold of the railing, hauling herself upwards and trying not to slide down, creating a mini avalanche of tiny stones behind her. Wisp meowed again, peering round the corner to keep an eye on her. "I'm coming, wait for me," she called, and then gasped in pain as a sharp stone dug into her foot. She paused to sweep it away. She looked up towards where Wisp was standing and saw a long spiral staircase leading upwards into a black abyss, seemingly spiralling on forever. She continued the climb, sleepily following after the little white cat. Lost in thought, she distractedly put her foot on a step, which crumbled away underfoot. She felt a horrid sinking feeling in her stomach as she watched a piece of staircase fall into the darkness below, leaving an ominous gap. Wisp gave a frightened whimper. "I'm okay," said Violet, gripping tightly to the banister. "I told you it isn't safe here. I think we should go back." There was a sudden loud rumble as another piece of staircase fell away from behind her. It created a domino effect, pulling down most of the staircase in a wake of destruction into a cloud of dust. They began running upwards. Violet coughed into her sleeve as she took deep, panicked gasps. The entire structure seemed to be crumbling away into darkness, as if nothing existed beyond it. She tried not to imagine falling down there. Adrenaline took over as she concentrated on following Wisp, who bounded higher and higher up the never-ending staircase. Their surroundings creaked and groaned in deafening loudness. Violet screamed as a piece of wall fell, then another and another. The banister gave way, coming clean off the disintegrating wall. She felt a cold flow of fear as she began falling backwards. Wisp cried out, helpless to stop her from falling. The steps underneath them crumbled slowly away into a million pieces, as if time had now slowed down. Violet fell backwards into a dark, enveloping dread. A loud buzzing noise penetrated the sound. Violet felt herself land with a thump onto a mattress. She opened her eyes and found herself back in her bedroom with her phone vibrating loudly from the bedside table like an angry wasp. She sat up with a jolt and silenced the morning alarm. Wisp stood wide-eyed at the foot of her crumpled bedsheets. Just another nightmare, Violet mumbled, blinking sleepily in the harsh morning light. She lay for a few moments longer to recover. Cold sweat dripped down her back and her pyjamas clung to her body. She sat up and looked at her phone and realised what day it was. We've got scarier things to deal with now, she said, reluctantly dragging herself out of bed. Wisp jumped down onto the floor, meowing to get her attention. At first Violet was too distracted to notice that her pyjamas were covered in chalky white dust. She froze, staring down at herself in disbelief. Her feet were lacerated with tiny cuts that stung. Was I sleepwalking? She pondered. Wisp chattered excitedly in cat language, trying to give her input into the situation. This was one of those times when having powers would be useful. Witches were able to understand their familiars, but Violet couldn't understand hers. We'll figure it out later. I need to get ready now, she said, hurrying to her dresser. The pristine white shirt and black pinafore that her mum had picked out for her last weekend sat neatly pressed and folded on her chest of drawers. To go with those were a brand new pair of shiny leather shoes and a black cape hanging in the wardrobe. Simple but stylish to make a professional first impression, so her mother had told her. She liked to think of herself as the expert on fashion and enjoyed playing dress-up with her daughter. Violet had been dreading this day for weeks, and now it was finally upon her. She'd been hoping for some great disaster, an illness, anything to get her out of having to attend this interview, but no such luck. It was traditional for witches to begin their formal magic training at the age of 13, and this was the year that Violet would begin hers. Ursa Major was no ordinary magic school. It was an elite boarding school for only the most talented young witches, or those who could afford the expensive tuition fees. It was renowned worldwide for its excellence, and most young witches could only dream of being granted the opportunity to study there. They were highly selective of their students, and all applicants were required to attend an interview to demonstrate their magical skills. This would be a nerve-wracking experience for most young witches, but Violet's anxiety was heightened by the fact that she had no powers whatsoever. While getting ready, Violet read from the notes that her parents had prepared for her to memorise. It began, "My name is Violet Darkmoor, daughter of renowned author and vampire aristocrat Lazarus Darkmoor, and famous witch entrepreneur and influencer Belladonna Darkmoor. I aspire to follow in my parents' footsteps to achieve greatness and hone my many talents as both a vampire and a witch." Her parents had made her recite this pretentious drivel all week, and it sounded even worse this morning. Long, gruelling evenings had been spent practicing this speech aloud. Her father had instructed her on the art of speaking with confidence and the importance of eye contact. Her mother snipped at her whenever she slouched and told her to smile and be charming. Even if she could remember the pages and pages of notes off by heart, Violet doubted that she would be able to make it sound convincing. The speech mostly discussed her parents' many achievements, and the few paragraphs that actually mentioned her were total lies. She couldn't cast spells, brew potions, or even fly, and she still hadn't even discovered her special talent, which everyone was expected to have. "I'm a total fraud," she muttered to herself as she brushed her hair into its usual tidy short bob. Her dark fringe sat starkly on her deathly pale forehead. She had her mother's purple-coloured eyes and her father's dark hair. Personality-wise, she didn't take after either of them. She inspected her fangs in the bathroom mirror as she brushed her teeth. Her fangs hadn't fully grown yet, and one was slightly bigger than the other, giving a slightly wonky look when she opened her mouth. Finally, she fastened her cape, which was slightly too long and drowned her petite frame. She may have looked reasonably presentable, but she felt decidedly mediocre as she headed out into the hallway. She was so engrossed in studying her notes for her speech that she didn't notice a dark shadow darting towards her. Her notes were snatched from her hands. Her brother cackled as he scuttled up the wall and onto the ceiling. Violet gave an exasperated groan. "Give it back, Nero." He hung upside down from the ceiling high above. "Come and get them yourself," he taunted. "That's not fair," she said, trying to jump up to reach, but he was too far away. "Let me read this great fictional novel we have here," said Nero, sitting cross-legged to read through her speech. He snickered to himself as his red eyes darted across the page. He spluttered with laughter. "Wow, I had no idea you were so talented, Violet. You could be a great comedian." Wisp hissed at him, but fearfully backed away as his wolf familiar, Damien, emerged from his bedroom. He let out a low growl at the little cat. Violet sighed. It was too early in the morning to deal with Nero's nonsense. She suspected that he was jealous of the recent attention her parents had been giving her, and the way they had boasted to all their friends of how their daughter was going to a prestigious magic school. He wasn't used to not being the centre of attention. "You know that Mum and Dad made me write all that," said Violet. "I don't even want to go." He ignored her, continuing to skim read the notes. "Potion making? Ha! You couldn't even brew a cup of tea." He hooted with laughter as he floated across the ceiling. "It's not funny," she grumbled. He carelessly tossed the papers away and they scattered down like confetti. "Now I need to put them all back in order again," she said, irritated. "I wouldn't bother if I were you," Nero sneered. "Even if you do get in, and that's a big if, they'll soon discover they have a useless crybaby in their hands and you'll be booted out of there." "You mean like how your school booted you out?" said Violet, raising her eyebrow as she scooped up the pile of papers. Nero stopped laughing and scowled. "It wasn't my fault that demon went on a rampage." He paused and grinned to himself as he recalled the memory. Last year he had been expelled from an elite wizard school for causing too many problems, mainly biting other students and breaking the rules on dark magic usage. His special power was summoning and controlling demons, and this had led to many altercations. He had managed to skate by for 2 years at magic school, considering his parents were well known and admired within the supernatural community. But as usual, Nero pushed the limits of what he could get away with until it was the last straw. To save his reputation, Lazarus simply used his mind control powers on the headmaster to remove unfavourable memories of his son's antics. He made him write a glowing report for his admission to Lustrum Academy for vampires, and just like that, all issues were forgotten. Wizard school was stifling my creative genius. He swooped through the air and landed gracefully on the banister. Violet shuffled her notes into the right order. "Uh-huh," she said distractedly. "Anyway, vampire school's way cooler, magic school's for losers," Nero pouted. "Why are you up so early anyway?" asked Violet wearily. It was the summer holidays, but Nero for the most part kept to the same sleeping schedule as his vampire school. He usually slept most of the day and snuck out at night with his friends to go to parties or cause local terror. "Mum's taking me to a modelling shoot," he said, brushing his hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair. "But she's supposed to be taking me to my interview," said Violet. "Well, tough luck." Nero smirked and dived backwards over the banister. His lanky dark figure shrunk into his bat form and he flapped his leathery wings away downstairs. His wolf familiar followed after him, barging past Violet and almost knocking the papers out her hands again. She sighed. Her brother always had to be an exhausting show-off, even first thing in the morning. She reluctantly headed down the grand staircase, passing by the many paintings of their ancestors that hung in ornate gold frames on the wooden panelled walls. In the centre of the landing hung a more recent portrait of her family. Lazarus had insisted on having an old-fashioned family painting commissioned to accompany their countless other paintings of long-dead relatives. Violet was only a toddler when it was painted, cradled in her mother's arms. Apparently she had cried and wriggled the entire time, but you couldn't tell from her perfect doll-like expression, gazing wide-eyed and innocent in her little dainty white frock. The artist had even managed to make Nero look angelic. Her parents posed with self-satisfied expressions as if proud of their 2 porcelain doll children. On the surface, Violet had a picture-perfect life with a picture-perfect family. The Dartmoor family lived in an old stately mansion that stood ominously on a quiet, secluded area of land in the moorlands outside the city. It was the sort of house that you might see on the cover of a magazine, with its elegant Gothic architecture and picturesque countryside surroundings amidst the wild moors. It was also the sort of house that human children would tell ghost stories about, too fearful to venture beyond the wrought iron gates. The house itself was old, but much of the furnishings were new, as a result of Belladonna's interior design efforts. Every room had a colour scheme of black and white with hints of gold and crimson red. Large, airy rooms were lavishly decorated with a mixture of antique furnishings, modern art pieces, crystal chandeliers, bouquets of roses and animal skulls. Violet reached the bottom of the stairs and crossed the black and white checkered floor which stretched across the downstairs hallway like an enormous chessboard. She entered the kitchen where there was a clattering of bewitched kitchen utensils busily preparing the breakfast. Her mother stood immaculate in a form-fitting white dress, smelling strongly of perfume and gazing intently into her golden magic mirror. Nero sat at the breakfast table, gazing into his own phone. Neither of them seemed to notice Violet as she slunk into the room. Belladonna gushed with excitement over his upcoming photoshoot. "It'll be such a big opportunity for you, my darling." She gave a wicked grin and leaned forwards. "You know, Davinia Caldwell's daughter applied to be a model a couple of years ago, but she didn't make the cut. It'll be so funny to see the look on her face when you appear on the cover of magazines," she chuckled. "I thought you were taking me to my interview today," said Violet quietly. She turned to her daughter. "Oh, look at the state of you. Come over here so I can fix you." She ushered her closer. Violet winced as her mother lifted her magic mirror. "Now let's make a few improvements." She swiped the glass with one finger and a black ribbon appeared in a flash, tightening itself around her shirt collar. Violet gasped for air as it tied itself into a bow. "Lovely. Now for your face." She tapped the mirror again and began magically applying blusher to give her rosy cheeks. "Mum, stop," Violet squirmed. Nero glanced up with a bemused expression as he gulped down a glass of blood. "Much better," her mother beamed. "Now stand up straight and smile," she ordered, and with a tap of the mirror, Violet felt her back straighten and her mouth stretch into an uncomfortable grin. "There, gorgeous," Belladonna exclaimed, snapping a photo. "You're not going to post that, are you?" said Violet wearily. She felt suffocated by her mother's constant need to post every detail of their lives online. "Of course, dear, it's your big day," she beamed, quickly typing up a caption. "Don't you want your mother to be proud of you?" "But I haven't even been accepted yet," Violet mumbled. "Hashtag reach for the stars," Belladonna exclaimed as she uploaded the picture. "And to answer your question, I'm afraid there's been a change of plans and I simply must accompany your brother today." Nero grinned. "But not to worry, my darling, I've bewitched my broom to take you." She waved her hand and a broomstick floated out from the cupboard and stood to attention. "You know I'm no good in brooms," said Violet. "Nonsense, all the other witches will be flying in their brooms. You ought to make a good first impression. It's on autopilot, you just have to sit on it. Even you can manage that, surely." Said Violet, slinking onto a seat at the breakfast table. "Maybe you'll fall off and get impaled on a fence," Nero snickered. "Shut up," Violet hissed. Now she had another mental image to add to her list of worries. Wisp snuck underneath the table, avoiding the large dark wolf. She stuck out her little pink tongue as she gazed up at the sizzling bacon and black pudding cooking on the stove. She couldn't eat anything, but she still enjoyed thinking about it. Belladonna's familiar, a large crow named Apollo, sat perched at the windowsill watching Wisp carefully with his beady eyes. Violet didn't have much of an appetite that morning, even if her familiar was eyeing up the bacon. Her mother glanced down at Wisp as if she were some dirty rat that had crawled out from a cellar. "You're not still insisting on taking that dopey old thing with you, are you?" "She's my familiar," said Violet. "Yes, darling, but she's, dead." She wrinkled her face in disgust. "So is Dad," said Violet. Nero spluttered with laughter. "He's undead, darling, there's a difference," said Belladonna. "No other students will be bringing along ghostly familiars. Really now, what use is a ghost?" Wisp's ears drooped sadly. Apollo swooped down onto the floor and cawed loudly in agreement. The little cat backed away nervously from the intimidating bird. "Why don't you bring Apollo?" she suggested. "He's a fine familiar. You'll look far more dignified with him by your side." Apollo proudly puffed up his glossy black feathers. "But Apollo is your familiar," said Violet. "Yes, but I'll let you borrow him just for today. We can find you a new familiar before you start school. Another cat even, how about that? A nice new cat. A Persian cat, perhaps, or a Burman, or a Sphinx." "I am keeping Wisp," said Violet stubbornly. "She's my best friend." She smiled down at her as her ears perked up. Belladonna sighed, tossing back her long golden hair. "Very well, but don't come crying to me when you get teased," she said, busying herself with her magic mirror. There was nothing she hated more than being disagreed with. Apollo gave Wisp an angry peck with his sharp beak, passing straight through her ghostly body. It didn't hurt her, but she still flinched. "It's pretty sad that your familiar is your only friend." Nero shook his head. Violet ignored him, pouring herself a bowl of cereal. Wisp cheekily stuck out her tongue at his wolf familiar while his back was turned. "I was always the most popular student back in my days at Ursa Major," Belladonna piped up. "Hopefully she'll take after her mother and make dozens of new friends." "Doubt it," said Nero. "All Violet's friends are imaginary." "Oh yes, I almost forgot about her old imaginary friend," she chuckled. "What was his name again? Sam?" "He was a fairy that lived at the bottom of the garden," Nero smirked. They both cackled with laughter. Violet munched her cereal, trying to tune them out. "Do you still talk to your imaginary friends?" Nero teased. She continued ignoring them. Belladonna held up her magic mirror. "Look now, I've already made you popular. Your post has over 50 likes already. Isn't that marvellous?" "Great," said Violet flatly. "Maybe you could be a model like your brother," she considered, tilting her head to one side as she examined her. "If only you were taller, with longer hair, and maybe a slightly different face." "If I were a different person?" Violet muttered. The frying pan hovered over to the kitchen table and served up a plateful of bacon and black pudding for Nero. Most of the objects in her house were bewitched by Belladonna. She poured herself some unpleasant green goop for her own breakfast. It smelled a bit like rotten cabbage, and there were dark pieces floating in the liquid. It was some new detoxifying, cleansing brew that she had been paid to promote. She snapped up a photo for another post. "Hashtag high vibe life," she beamed. Belladonna was an influencer, and Violet still wasn't entirely sure what that title meant. She ran an online blog and various social media accounts which informed her followers on how to summon success and live a high vibe life, whatever that meant. Businesses sometimes paid her to promote their goods, and her services were in high demand considering that she was popular within the supernatural community. She seemed gifted in the art of swaying people to purchase whatever product or service she was promoting, whether it was a new fad potion to lose weight or a new line of enchanted long-lasting makeup. Her followers ate up her rambling posts about living her best hashtag boss witch life with her important famous husband as a hashtag power couple. She was very fond of hashtags. Her glimmering eyes scoured the comments on her latest post. She inhaled deeply. I just love that boost of psychic energy in the morning, she grinned. Her expression darkened. Uh-oh, we have a troll. I'll have to put a hex on them later. She swiped a negative comment away. And what's this? Ugh, your Aunt Hazel wishes you good luck, Violet, she said bitterly. Belladonna disliked her sister immensely and rarely spoke with her. Now there's some motivation to stick in with your studies. You don't want to end up like your crazy Aunt Hazel, working in that tatty old tea shop of hers. Violet knew very little about her Aunt Hazel and had only met her on a handful of occasions during her childhood. She always sent tasty treats for her and Nero's birthdays every year. It's a pity, maybe she could have made something of herself, she shook her head pitifully. If only she hadn't gone off the rails and gotten sent to the loony bin. I think she was always jealous of my success. Violet and Nero ate their breakfasts while their mother waffled on about her glory days as a student at Ursa Major. She recalled how she impressed her teachers with her ability to bewitch inanimate objects and command them to her will, and how she went on to become head girl and captain of the broom dancing team. Violet's mind drifted to her strange dream about the building falling down, and the mystery of her dirty feet in pyjamas. Do you know if I was sleepwalking last night? She interrupted. I don't think so, darling. Why don't you go ask your father? He was up most of the night. Here, take this while you're at it. She placed a decanter of blood and an empty glass onto a tray. He's in his study. Violet carefully carried the tray out of the kitchen and along the hallway to her father's study. She tried to avoid looking at or smelling the foul red liquid as it sloshed around. She carefully knocked on the wooden door, suspecting that he would still be grumpy after their disagreement at dinner. Yes, he responded in a slightly irritated voice. Violet pushed open the door with her shoulder. The room was dim, the heavy black curtains closed to block out the sun. The only light source came from an old-fashioned lamp on his desk. Her father's study was the only room off-limits to Belladonna's interior design products. Stepping inside was like entering a time capsule to an era when taxidermy and grandfather clocks were the height of fashion, and typewriters and gramophones were the latest technology. The walls were lined with shelves of books, mostly in topics related to psychology, leadership, social mastery and the history of noblemen and emperors. He had a vast collection of antique first edition books in beautiful leather-bound covers with gold lettering. Framed black and white photographs and certificates hung on the walls, all of his fondest memories and achievements. Behind him were a collection of stuffed birds, a stag's head and a fox in a glass display case, most of which he had killed himself. Lazarus sat in front of his typewriter looking busy and important, elegantly dressed as always in a white shirt and black waistcoat. He glanced up at Violet briefly, then looked back at the paper he was typing. Bring it here, he commanded. Violet obeyed, stepping across the faded antique rug. Wisp waited outside timidly. She placed the tray carefully in his desk in the one spot that wasn't covered by piles of books or paper stacks. He seemed barely aware of her presence. He continued typing, the metallic keys click-clacking loudly. She waited patiently for him to finish. He eventually paused and sighed. Yes. Do you know if I was sleepwalking last night? She asked. What? He asked, wearily stretching. It's just I think I might have been, she said nervously. I had a scary dream. Lazarus whipped out a comb and brushed back his slick black hair. I don't recall, he said, turning his attention back to his typewriter. It felt so real, Violet pondered, like I was going to die. Lazarus pulled out the piece of paper from the typewriter to read over, studying it intensely. He said. A voice called cheerfully from the doorway. Hey, Dad. Lazarus raised his head and smiled, revealing his startlingly pointy white fangs. Good morning, you're up bright and early, he said, putting away his papers. Nero bounded over, jumping up to sit on the desk. He knocked over a stack of letters, but their father didn't seem to notice or care. How's the writing going? Nero asked. Good until this one came along to disturb me and complain. Lazarus narrowed his eyes at Violet. She's always complaining, said Nero. He said, standing up from the seat and shuffling his papers into a neat pile. "Are you all prepared for that modelling shoot today? It should be good exposure for the coven." Violet felt invisible while they chatted about Nero's silly modelling career. She couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. All he had to do was stand in front of a camera. The only reason he'd even gotten into modelling was because their mum had contacts in the fashion industry. Her parents always seemed impressed by the bare minimum when it came to Nero. "I've got my interview today," said Violet quietly. "That's today, is it?" He poured himself a drink from the decanter. "She's gonna fail," Nero smirked. Lazarus raised the glass to his lips, his serious eyes peering over at her. "There are no failures in this family." He spoke the word failures as if it were some vulgar word. "I'll try my best," said Violet. "You'd better start trying," he barked. "I shall soon be occupied with my new book launch, and your mother and I haven't the time nor the patience to homeschool you." Violet shuddered at the memory of her parents' many attempts to teach her, the failed flying lessons with her father, and the useless spell-casting attempts and disastrous potion-making classes with her mother. It wasn't for lack of trying or lack of interest. Violet loved all things to do with magic and the supernatural. She loved to read, spending most of her days shut away in a room devouring books. Being half witch and half vampire was supposed to grant her double sets of powers. At least, that was how it usually worked. In Violet's case, she was different. She couldn't fly, shapeshift into a bat, or perform any acts of magic, much to her parents' shame and anguish. Their lessons usually ended with her being scolded and berated for her uselessness. "The tuition fees for this school are costing us a fortune," said Lazarus, "so I expect to see positive results. Perhaps if you paid more attention to the lessons in my books, you could learn a thing or two about selling yourself. You need to toughen up if you intend to make anything of yourself in this world. In life, the strong conquer the weak." Lazarus considered himself a philosopher and an expert on most things. He had published an autobiography many years ago about his life surviving as a vampire orphan, back in the days when vampires were outcast from human society. His work had transformed him into a sort of cult icon and helped to paint vampires in a positive light. He was very convincing in the way he portrayed his version of events. "You are part vampire, and thus you need to feed from others in order to gain power." He refilled the glass of blood from the pitcher and held it out for her to drink. She turned away. "Go on," said Nero. "Chug it." "No thanks, I'm full from breakfast. I don't want to be late, so I'd better get going," she babbled, hurrying out the room. Lazarus gave an exasperated sigh. Nero took the glass and downed the liquid himself. "Good lad," said Lazarus, giving him a pat on the head like an obedient dog. Violet headed into the hallway. Her mother scurried out from the kitchen clutching a gold pendant. "You remember we went over this before," she said, fastening the chain around her daughter's neck. "When they ask you to demonstrate your magical ability, just tap the eye 3 times and it'll do the rest. I bewitched it earlier." The eye was a symbol of their coven. Belladonna wore her own eye pendant round her neck, and Lazarus wore it as a brooch. "I still think it feels like cheating," Violet mumbled. "Oh, darling, sometimes we need to cheat to get ahead in life," said Belladonna. "You especially," she added. Lazarus and Nero emerged from the study, chatting amongst themselves amicably. "What happens if I do get accepted? What am I supposed to do then? How can I keep pretending?" said Violet. But her mother had gripped hold of her shoulders and was steering her towards the front door, the broom floating alongside. "Positive mental attitude," she exclaimed. "You're going to be popular and talented, and someday you'll have a fabulous career and marry a rich man." "But what if I don't want to marry a rich man?" She leaned forwards and hissed. "Then you can inherit his money when he dies under mysterious circumstances." She chuckled, then snapped upright. "Now off you go, and good luck, my darling," she smiled cheerfully. She shoved the broom into her arms and opened the front door. Lazarus stepped away from the morning light. She quickly pushed her out and slammed the door shut behind her. Wisp passed through the door a few seconds later to join Violet by her side, gazing up at her wistfully. Her family chuckled amongst themselves in the hallway. She took a deep breath of fresh morning air. At least she could be free from her family for a little while. She often felt drained of energy from being in their presence. "We can do this," she said, looking down at Wisp. She meowed in agreement. Violet carefully mounted the broom. It was still at first, and she wondered if there was some magic word she was supposed to utter, or if the spell had stopped working. Just as she was about to call for her mum, the broom lunged forwards and upwards suddenly, almost knocking her backwards in surprise. She rose up into the air. Wisp floated after her. She clung on tightly and leaned forwards, her stomach churning as she zoomed higher and higher into the sky. So yeah, that was chapter 1 of the Netherworld, and I hope you enjoyed it. And like I say, I don't know if I'm going to upload any more of it, but I would like to have it published at some point. I'm nearly finished it at the moment. I've just got like maybe about 3 more chapters to write, and I've kind of got it all in my head how I'm going to wrap it up. And then obviously I need to edit it, and I've got some people who've offered to proofread it for me and give some feedback. So once all that's done, I'm hoping to send it off into the world. So yeah, thanks for listening and watching, and please leave a like if you enjoyed it, if you want any more of this type of content. So thank you.